everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Mollie and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about a solved case from England when a mother and her two young children were found horrifically killed in their own home one day in mid-2000. A triple murder investigation was launched by the police to establish exactly who had done this, who had committed this awful crime, and what was the motive. It didn't take long at all for detectives to determine that the perpetrator was someone who was very close to home, someone who had gone on the run immediately after carrying out these murders. But what the police would soon realise was that this killer was an entire week ahead of them. He'd been on the run for 7 whole days by the time the victims' bodies were discovered, so the police had to set up a nationwide manhunt to try and find him and bring him to justice. And when they did, when he was finally apprehended, they were stunned by just how little this perpetrator actually cared about what he had done, how little guilt and remorse he showed for brutally murdering the people that he was supposed to love and protect. Let's delve into the shocking case of the Austen family murders. But quickly before we get into the case, I would just like to say a big thank you to Heyday for very kindly sponsoring this section of the video. Heyday is a super fun farming lifestyle simulator mobile game where you can build your very own farm from the ground up and design it so that it's exactly how you want it to look, your perfect farm. Fun fact about me, I am absolutely obsessed with animals. My parents always used to take me and my siblings to farms to see farm animals when we were growing up. So playing Heyday honestly fills me with so much nostalgia and I love it. So of course my favourite part of the game is getting to take care of the animals on my farm, like the cows and the chickens and the pigs. But you can even add other pets as you progress through the game. You can get a dog and a cat and even more playful pets. But as well as looking after the animals, there are so many other enjoyable tasks for you to complete at your own pace, from harvesting and trading, creating and selling homemade baked goods, to decorating the farm and the buildings and giving it your very own personal touch. What I love about Heyday is that it's such a simple and easygoing game to play. It's the perfect mobile game for when you feel the need to wind down and recharge, maybe after a busy day working or just running errands, because it's so relaxing and so fun and playful. And right now is the perfect time to download Heyday and have a go at creating your very own farm yourself, because if you go through my link in the description box or scan the QR code that is on the screen right now, you can claim an exclusive 16 item reward pack, which is usually worth $15.99. So this is a real treat just for you guys, and you only have until February the 15th to claim it, so be quick. Some of my favourite items in the reward pack include the toy soldier, the saxophone and the pig balloon. But like I said, there are 16 items for you to claim, so definitely let me know your favourites in the comments. Thank you so much once again to Heyday for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Thank you as always to all of you guys watching for always showing your support to the sponsors that we work with on this channel. And now let's just get into the case. But just before we continue, please listen carefully to the following. This video contains heavy themes such as domestic abuse, including mental and emotional abuse, child abuse, animal abuse, coercive control and attempted suicide. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back more than 24 years now to the summer of 2000 in Northampton, which is a town located in Northamptonshire in the East Midlands area of England. And Northampton was home to the Austen family, which consisted of married couple Philip and Claire Austen, both aged 31 at the time that this case occurred, their 2 children, 8-year-old Kieran Austen and 7-year-old Jade Austen, and their 3 pets. They had 2 dogs, 2 poodles named Dandy and Sooty, and a cat called Snoopy. So let's talk a little bit more about this family of 4, starting with Philip. So Philip Austen was born in February of 1969 in Northampton, so I believe he had lived there his whole life. He came from a very normal working class family. He was an only child and his parents both worked. His dad was a lorry driver and his mother was a care worker. And as a child, Philip was described by those that knew him as being very kind of quiet and reserved. He was always a bit of a loner, was Philip Austen. And this was something that carried on into his adult life. He never really had that many friends. He seemed to be someone who found it difficult to make conversation with people, a bit socially awkward. He just never really drew that much attention to himself, very much someone that was kind of in the background. Philip himself would later go on to claim that he had a very difficult home life growing up. He described how as a child his father was extremely physically abusive towards him, which of course would have had a big impact on him and his mental state. It is important to mention though that this account has only come from Philip himself. Other family members denied that this was the case, that his father was very violent, or at least no more than other parents were to their children back then. But yeah, that is what Philip claimed. It would appear as though he always had a bit of a rocky relationship with his parents, which we'll come back to. We'll talk more about that in a short while. But yeah, he never really got on with them very well, it seemed. After leaving school as a teen, Philip Austin entered the world of work. He worked in a factory for a while. He then went on to work in a supermarket warehouse, and eventually he started working as a forklift truck driver, which is the job that he had at the time that this case took place, by the time he was in his early 30s. But we have jumped ahead slightly there, back to when Philip was in his 20s, early 20s, and that was when he met the woman that would go on to become his wife. He met Claire Quinn in 1991. Claire Louise Golden Quinn was a 21-year-old woman by 1991. She was born in 1969, and I believe she was also born and raised in Northampton. Her mother was named Carol Quinn, and Claire also had a stepfather named Harry, both of whom she seemed to be incredibly close to. And Claire was described as being a very happy and friendly young woman. She was loyal and dependable and gregarious, and she was said to have been just a lot of fun to be around. One of Claire's best friends, Diane, described how Claire would love to go out and have fun. She'd go on nights out with her friends to pubs and bars, and she would be straight on the dance floor with Diane just having a laugh. And in fact, it was on one of her nights out in 1991 when Claire met Philip Austin. They were both in the same bar. Claire had been there with her friends, and Philip seemed to take a pretty instant interest in Claire. He saw her sitting at the bar, clearly thought that she was very beautiful and attractive, and so he decided to approach her. According to one documentary, he actually went out and bought a rose, and he approached her with it in the bar. He gave Claire this rose, which of course I'm sure would have really flattered Claire. She would have thought that it was really, really sweet and kind, and yeah, they struck up a conversation, and Claire really liked him. She thought that Philip Austin seemed like a really nice young man, and they quickly started dating. And Claire seemed to be really happy with Philip, and so obviously her loved ones were very happy for her. I mean, they did think that it was a little bit strange that Claire had actually taken a liking to Philip Austin, because in all honesty, they could not have been more different than night and day. Of course, they do say that opposites attract, but Philip and Claire were just the complete polar opposites of each other. That yeah, her friends and family just thought that it was a bit odd that Claire had ended up with him. So for example, like I said, Claire was always a very happy and bubbly young woman. She was friendly, seems like she was the kind of person that could chat to anyone, honestly. Whereas Philip was incredibly different in regards to that kind of thing. As we discussed, he was always very reserved and quiet, very, very much an introvert, whereas Claire was a bit of an extrovert. But you know, Claire loved him, so her family and friends welcomed him in with open arms. I mean, they kind of had to, because Philip and Claire's relationship seemed to progress very quickly. Literally just a couple of months after they started dating, Claire discovered that she was pregnant with Philip's baby. And the following year, in February of 1992, she gave birth to a little baby boy who they named Kieran. And Philip and Claire seemed really, really happy with their baby boy. They seemed to enjoy their new life as parents. Claire's parents, Carol and Harry, said that Philip seemed to adjust really well to being a dad. At first, he was very hands-on and reliable and caring. And not long at all after Kieran was born, would you believe it, Claire actually fell pregnant again. And just the year after, in April of 1993, Philip and Claire's little baby girl was born. They decided to call her Jade, and their family of 4 was complete. And again, they were over the moon when Jade entered the world, especially her big brother Kieran. As they grew up together, the two siblings were incredibly close, probably because they were so close in age. There was literally just 14 months between them. But yeah, they were almost like best friends, and Kieran was always so caring and protective over Jade. Claire's parents, so Kieran and Jade's grandparents, Carol and Harry, said that in most of the pictures they have of Kieran and Jade together. Kieran can usually be seen with his arm around Jade. He just seemed to have this brotherly instinct, I guess, to, you know, show her that affection and look after her. As he grew up, Kieran was described as being a very inquisitive little boy. His grandparents said that he was just always asking questions about things, questions about people, about life, whatever it may be. And his granddad, Harry, even said that sometimes when Kieran asked a question, he wouldn't even wait for his granddad to finish giving him the answer before he had another question to ask. His grandmother, Carol, also described how Kieran was a boy with a big appetite, always going around saying that he was hungry. He never stopped eating. His little sister, Jade, was described as being a very angelic little girl. Carol said that she could be quite quiet and shy at times, but she was also a little mischief maker. And apparently she used to really enjoy going through her grandma's jewellery box and also baking with her grandma. They would bake all sorts together, cakes and tarts and things like that, and Jade loved it. Just to quickly interrupt here a second, I do apologise if you can hear any building work going on. It's briefly stopped now, but my neighbours are having some work done and it is very loud, so if you can hear that throughout this video, I do apologise. But anyway, just a couple of months after Jade was born, in July of 1993, Philip and Claire decided to tie the knot. They got married, making Claire Quinn Claire Austin. By all accounts, they had a good day, a good wedding, although it was quite small as Philip didn't really have anyone in his life attending. I think he maybe had a couple of guests, whereas Claire had a lot of people in attendance. You see, by this point, by the time they got married, Philip Austin had actually cut a lot, if not all of his relatives out of his life. As I mentioned before, he'd always had a bit of a rocky relationship with his parents, and this seemed to come to a head after Claire and Philip's first child, Kieran, was born. According to reports, Philip's mother just kind of tried to take over when Kieran came along, telling Philip and Claire what they should do, how they should parent, etc, etc. And apparently this was just the final straw for Philip, and he decided that he didn't want anything to do with his parents anymore. He told them to stay away from him and his family. But yeah, anyway, they got married and they settled as a family of 4 in Northampton. Philip and Claire lived with their kids in a house on a private housing estate in Northampton called Standon's Bar. They got their 2 dogs, Dandy and Sooty, and their cat Snoopy, and they started building their lives together there. And like I said earlier, at first everything seemed, well, amazing really. Both Philip and Claire seemed to really thrive in parenthood, and to an outsider's perspective, they seemed to have a really good marriage. The Austins seemed like a normal, happy family. However, as the years passed by, there were a couple of cracks which appeared to emerge in this seemingly normal family, as Philip Austin started exhibiting some behaviours which caused a lot of arguments between him and his wife. So for example, he started being just quite frivolous, I guess, with money. Now, Philip and Claire were not like well off or anything. I don't think they were like hugely struggling financially, but also, you know, they didn't have money that they could just waste. They did have to be careful with their finances because it could be hard at times to get by with 2 children. And Claire she was very careful with money. Everything that the kids needed, she would save really hard for. She would do everything that she could to make sure that they didn't go without. But her husband, Philip, on the other hand, well, he was the opposite. Like I said, he started to become very, very careless with money. And he would spend a lot of money on things that he didn't even need. Like, for instance, apparently one time he brought himself a set of golf clubs, which are not cheap at all. Golf clubs can be very expensive, and he bought this set even though he didn't play golf. He wasn't a golfer. Another time he bought a load of weights for weight training, which again, he didn't do. He didn't even use them, so it was just a waste of money. He would spend a load of money on things like new clothes and new trainers for himself. So whilst, like I said, Claire was saving every penny to buy stuff for the kids, Philip was just going off and spending a load of money on himself without talking it through with Claire first. And of course, this annoyed Claire. It really, really upset her. But every time she would confront her husband about this, rather than apologising, Philip Austin would literally just pack a bag and he would leave. He would pack his things and just take off for a few days and not tell Claire where he was going. And in fact, sometimes Claire would worry about him so much whilst he was away because he just wouldn't make any contact at all that she would call the police and report him as missing. But I mean, this eventually stopped. She stopped calling the police because it got to the point where he was doing it so much. Anytime they had an argument, he would just leave. And what's even more twisted is that he would do this. He would just abandon Claire with the kids for days on end because he wanted her to realise just how much she needed him, how she wouldn't be able to cope without him. That was the thing about Philip Austin. He was an incredibly controlling and manipulative man. He had to be the dominant one in the relationship. He almost saw himself as more superior to Claire because he knew that she wouldn't be able to get by without him because he was the breadwinner, I suppose. Whilst he worked his job as a forklift truck driver to bring in the money, Claire stayed home and looked after the children because obviously they were very young. So him taking off and abandoning her was almost his way of teaching her a lesson, of saying, yeah, you realise just how much you need me, how much you would struggle without me. It was his way of maintaining that control in the relationship. In addition to that, he was said to constantly belittle Claire and just really try and knock her self-confidence. He would make fun of her appearance and comment on things like her size and her weight. He was very, very emotionally and mentally abusive towards her. But Claire would always forgive him. She would just deal with this abuse and she would always take him back when he would leave and then return because her mindset was she didn't want to split up the family. She didn't want to separate from Philip because she wanted her two kids to grow up in a house with both of their parents present, which again, Philip knew. He knew that she wanted that. So effectively, I think he knew that he could do anything. He could treat Claire horrendously and she would always take him back because of how much she loved her children and how she always wanted what she thought was best for them. However, Philip Austin wasn't just abusive towards his wife, he was also abusive towards his children. Now, whilst there is apparently no evidence that he was ever physically abusive, ever violent towards Claire, we do know that he was violent and aggressive towards his kids. Family members noticed as Kieran and Jade grew up that when Philip would play with them, he would be very, very rough, particularly when he would play with Kieran. So for example, his idea of just playing around with Kieran would involve doing things like holding him upside down by his ankles for long periods of time and patting him hard on the stomach and chest to the point where you could apparently tell that Kieran wasn't enjoying himself because it was hurting him. His dad was hurting him and yet Philip wouldn't stop. Even when Kieran would be brought to tears because of this, Philip wouldn't stop. He was just said to be very, quote, heavy-handed with Kieran. And one day when both Kieran and Jade were with their grandparents, Carol and Harry, they made some very disturbing comments to them about how their father treated them. So apparently, whilst Carol and Harry were looking after their grandkids one day, Kieran and Jade were sat on chairs at this breakfast bar and Kieran started kicking the side of it, the side of this breakfast bar, which his grandma Carol told him to stop doing because, you know, it could damage the bricks. But Kieran kept doing it anyway, and that was when his little sister Jade turned to him and said, quote, "Kieran, stop it or else you'll get a good hiding, won't he, Nanny?" Now, in case you are unaware, a good hiding is a British expression which means a severe beating. So of course, naturally, this comment that Jade made horrified her grandparents, Carol and Harry. And Carol replied to Jade saying, no one's going to get a good hiding here. And that was when Jade said, well, that's what happens at home. That's what Dad does at home, doesn't he, Kieran? And Kieran said yes. And then the kids went on to describe how their dad would sometimes put his hands around their neck. And they demonstrated to Carol and Harry how he did it like this. Philip Austin just had such a violent temper with the kids. He would fly into these rages, and when Claire was informed about this from her parents, she too was horrified and she immediately confronted her husband about this, and she threatened him actually. As I mentioned before, Claire never wanted to leave Philip Austin, number one, because she was financially reliant on him, and number two, because she didn't want to split up the family for her children. So she would just put up with the abuse from Philip when it was towards her. But of course, it was a completely different story when she discovered that he had been putting his hands on the kids. She was furious and she gave her husband an ultimatum. Either he goes and gets help, professional professional help for his temper, or else that was it. She would be filing for divorce and taking the kids. And so, having no other choice, Philip agreed, and he started doing this anger management course, and he had counselling through the NSPCC, which is the National Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children in Britain. However, it turns out that he literally only went for like 2 or 3 of these sessions before he stopped. He just stopped going. I don't think he completed the course. But despite this, it did actually seem to make a difference. For a while anyway, it did appear as though Philip had turned a corner, and he was trying to be better, trying to get control of his temper, and things seemed to be going well with the family again. And following this, Claire's life started to also take a bit more of a positive turn. As I mentioned, whilst Kieran and Jade were very young, she was a stay-at-home mum, but as the kids got older and they both started going to school every day, she got a little bit of that freedom back that she hadn't had in so long, and she decided that she wanted to get back into work. She wanted to get a job, and she did. She started working part-time as a carer for the local council, which was exactly what she needed, I think. She was really happy to be working again, to be able to earn her own money and just have that bit more independence and not have to be so reliant on her husband Philip. But of course, being the controlling and abusive partner that he was deep down, Philip hated this. It's believed that he probably hated it when his wife went back into the world of work, because for him it symbolized him losing that control over her, because she wouldn't be so dependent on him anymore. Like I said, after those few counselling sessions, things seemed to get better for the Austen family for a while. Philip seemed to be making more of an effort with his children, doing things like taking them to the park and playing football with them. In the summer of 2000, they all went on a family holiday to Spain, and Claire told her mother Carol that everything was going really well within the family again, and that she and Philip were getting on better now than they had ever done before. But often individuals, abusive partners like Philip Austen, are ticking time bombs just waiting to explode. And in July of 2000, that time came for Philip, when his violent and abusive behaviour towards his family took a far more sinister and deadly turn. I believe it was the 9th of July 2000, a Sunday, and that day Philip and Claire had decided to take the kids on a family trip to the cinema to watch a film. Now, before they left to go to the cinema, Kieran was sat doing some of his homework, and apparently an argument broke out between Philip Austen and Kieran during this. Philip became angry with his son because of the homework, and he just flew off the handle. He was shouting and screaming at him, and Claire was telling him to stop, to just leave Kieran alone. And following this, Philip reportedly locked himself in the bathroom and had a tantrum, essentially. This 31-year-old man had a tantrum about his 8-year-old son and his homework. So as a result of this, they didn't end up going to the cinema, and later that Sunday night, Claire's mother Carol rang the house to ask how the cinema went. Did they all enjoy the film? And Philip Austen answered the phone, which was very unusual because Carol said that Philip never normally picked up the phone, but anyway, he did. He spoke to his mother-in-law. He said that Claire was upstairs, so she couldn't come to the phone, and so Carol just said to Philip, okay, well, tell Claire I'll give her a call tomorrow. Carol said that she could tell that something was off about this phone call. She could tell that Philip and Claire had probably had an argument, and so I think she wanted to just get off the phone pretty quick. So yeah, she ended the call with Philip, and she tried to ring back the next day to speak with her daughter, only she got no response. Claire didn't pick up. Carol's call just went straight to voicemail, as did the rest of the calls that Carol made. As the days passed by, Carol tried to ring Claire back numerous times, but every single time it just went straight to voicemail. Now, Carol and her partner Harry, Claire's stepfather, didn't think too much of this sudden silence from Claire at first. Like I mentioned, Carol could sense from her phone conversation with Philip Austen on the 9th that they'd probably had an argument or something, and so when Claire wasn't answering, they assumed that I don't know, maybe they were taking some time, just them as a family, trying to patch things up, and that's why they hadn't heard from them. However, time continued to pass and there was still no word from them, and so naturally they started to become concerned. And they weren't the only ones. Neighbours of Philip and Claire's also started to worry about them, as they realised that they hadn't seen any of the family leaving or returning to the house in days. They hadn't seen Philip, they hadn't seen Claire, they hadn't seen the kids. Claire's car looked like it hadn't been moved in days. It all just seemed very odd. And then about a week later, on the 17th of July 2000, Carol and Harry received a very worrying phone call. I expect that when they heard the phone ring, they were hoping that it would be their daughter Claire finally getting in touch, but it wasn't. It was actually their grandchildren, Kieran and Jade's school. The school had decided to contact Carol and Harry because neither Jade nor Kieran had been to school in about a week without reason. They hadn't been informed by their parents that, you know, the kids were sick or anything, or that they'd gone on holiday, and when they tried to phone Claire and Philip Austin, they too received no answer. And so the school reached out to Claire's parents, Carol and Harry, instead, and Carol said that it was at this point when alarm bells started to ring. When they learned that the kids had been absent from school for a week, that was when panic really set in. And so Harry and Carol immediately headed to Philip and Claire's house on Standon's Barn, and whilst Carol started chatting with one of Claire's neighbours, Harry let himself in using the spare key as the front door was locked. So Harry unlocked the front door and he went to push it open, which was difficult actually, because as he looked down he could see a load of leaflets and letters on the floor that had been posted through the letterbox. Where no one had picked up the mail, it meant that it was hard to push the door open, and Harry's initial thought when he saw this was that, oh, they must have gone away somewhere. Philip and Claire must have taken the kids on holiday or something and just not told her, hence why the mail has gathered in front of the door. There's been no one here to pick it up. But then, just seconds later, Harry was hit with the most foul smell. This horrendous odour just almost knocked him back, and as he walked through the house towards the kitchen, he realised what the source of this smell was. It was his stepdaughter, 31-year-old Claire Austin. It was Claire's dead body. Claire was lying dead in a pool of her own blood on the kitchen floor. That smell was her body starting to decompose in the heat of the summer. So horrified, Harry ran back towards the front door and he ordered his wife Carol to stay away, to not come inside, because something had happened. Claire had done something to herself. Harry actually thought initially that Claire had harmed herself, killed herself, because he could see some marks or cuts to her wrist, but Claire's mother Carol knew that there was no way that Claire would have done that. So Carol barged her way in, she went into the kitchen, she saw her daughter's lifeless body on the kitchen floor, and her first thought was, oh my god, where are the children? Where's Kieran and Jade? So Carol and Harry rushed upstairs, where they were confronted with even more unimaginable horrors. They walked into 8-year-old Kieran's bedroom and found that he too was dead. He was lying dead on his bed, as was his little sister Jade. Harry ran straight to Jade's bedroom and discovered her dead on her bedroom floor. And also found dead inside the house were the 2 family dogs, the 2 poodles, Dandy and Sooty. One of the poodles was lying dead near to Claire's body in the kitchen, and the other was found dead next to the tumble dryer in the home. The second dog had actually been hidden by this tumble dryer, it seemed. Of course, they had all been murdered. Claire, Kieran, Jade and the 2 dogs had been horrifically murdered. It was later established that the kids had been strangled to death, that the 2 dogs had been beaten to death with a mallet, and Claire, well, she had a number of different injuries. It was clear that the killer had used a few methods to try and end her life. She too had been beaten with a mallet and strangled. It appeared as though she'd actually been strangled with her own bra, which was still wrapped around her neck. But in addition to that, she'd also been stabbed with a knife. 2 knives, actually, I believe. Apparently one of the knives had literally broken off as the killer was using it, and the handle was stuck to her arm, and the other knife she was lying on top of. She'd sustained numerous stab wounds to her body with 2 large carving knives. The attack on Claire was just unbelievable, unbelievably cruel. I mean, this whole crime was unbelievable. What kind of person could do something like this to a mother and her 2 children? Who on earth was responsible for this? Well, Claire's parents, Carol and Harry, knew immediately. As soon as they found their bodies, they said that they just knew that their son-in-law was the perpetrator. Philip Austin had brutally murdered his entire family. Of course, immediately after arriving at the house, Carol and Harry called the police, who were quickly at the scene. And whilst detectives also had their immediate suspicions that the husband and father of this family, Philip Austin, was the murderer, they obviously had to rule out other possible theories too. They couldn't just jump straight to the conclusion that Philip was guilty. I mean, maybe he himself was a victim. Maybe he'd been kidnapped or something and killed elsewhere. Who knows? However, very quickly they realised that that most likely wasn't the case. It really did seem like this was a domestic triple homicide, as there was no evidence to support any other theory or motive. No signs of forced entry, no signs of a robbery or burglary, nothing had been stolen. And something that search teams discovered inside of the house, I believe in Claire and Philip's bedroom, was this pile of men's clothing on the floor. It was Philip's clothing, and amongst this clothing was a pair of cargo trousers which looked to have blood spatter on them, indicating that these clothes were what the killer was wearing when he carried out this attack. So evidence was pointing directly at Philip. It really did seem like he was the offender, but where on earth was he now? Well, it seemed as though he had gone on the run following this killing spree. The detectives were ultimately able to establish that the murders had most likely taken place about a week before the bodies were found. As we know, they were found dead on the 17th of July 2000, and the police were able to conclude that they had most likely been killed on the 10th of July, as that was the last day that the kids had been to school. They'd been to school on the 10th, and then on the 11th there was no sign of them. So that meant that the prime suspect, Philip Austin, had been on the run for an entire week. He was 7 whole days ahead of the police. So I mean, he could have been anywhere by now. He could have fled the country if he wanted to. So a manhunt operation swiftly began to try and track down Philip Austin. And one thing that the police realised pretty quickly was that Philip's car was missing. Claire's car was still parked outside of the address, but Philip's car was gone. So as news of these horrific murders spread, the police appealed to the public, asking people to essentially be on the lookout for it, be on the lookout for Philip's car. And it wasn't long before someone found it. A woman contacted the police saying that a car matching the description of the one from the appeal had been left just abandoned outside of her house in Northampton. She said that it had been parked there for about a week and it hadn't moved. So the police went to her house, and sure enough, it was Philip Austin's car. It was his license plate. But if it had been there for a whole week since the murders, then how on earth was Philip travelling around whilst he was on the run? Well, inside of his abandoned car, the police found some clues. They firstly discovered one of the murder weapons. They found the bloody mallet in a bag in the back seat of the car, and the handle of this mallet was actually bent where Philip had beaten both Claire and the dogs with it with such force that it had bent out of shape. Also found in this bag in the car was, I think, like a half-eaten McDonald's breakfast meal, a newspaper from the 10th of July, the day that the murders occurred, and also an Auto Trader magazine, I believe. Now, Auto Trader is a marketplace for people buying and selling old cars, and when the police looked through this magazine, they discovered that someone, Philip, had circled a couple of different cars that he was clearly interested in. So police made contact with the people who were selling these particular cars, and they found out that on the day of the killings, sure enough, Philip had gone and bought one of them. It was clear that he'd done this. He purchased this car because he was going to use it as his getaway vehicle. He obviously couldn't use his own vehicle whilst he was on the run, because then police would be able to trace him through his license plate. So he decided to abandon his old car outside of that house in Northampton and buy a new one. As part of their inquiries to try and locate Philip Austin, Austin, the police started delving into his bank records in an attempt to learn where else he'd been spending his money since fleeing after the murders. And through this, they were able to see that he'd been using a lot of ATM machines around the north of England. He'd travelled up to the north. Apparently they could see that he'd been around Blackpool and Whitney Bay and Scarborough, and he'd been staying in different guest houses and hotels there and going to pubs and bars. So Northampton police were reaching out to the police departments in these parts of the country that Philip had been to and alerting them that, you know, they were looking for this man, this murder suspect who was on the run. But Philip Austin would be unable to stay on the run for much longer. Just a couple of days after the manhunt for him began, he was found. 10 days after the murders and 3 days after the discovery of the bodies on the 20th of July 2000, a member of the public in the Lake District, which is located in Cumbria in the northwest of England, it's just under 200 miles away from Northampton, they contacted the Cumbria police, alerting them to the fact that they had seen a man behaving very, very strangely. Basically, this man was parked in a lay-by on the side of the road in the Lake District. He'd been just sitting in his car for a while before he got out and just started, I think, walking around his car. But the reason that this member of the public became concerned and decided to ring the police was because they could see that his arms were covered in blood. It looked as though he had maybe tried to slit his wrists or something. So Cumbria police immediately responded to this report. They went straight to this lay-by where, sure enough, they found this man in his car with cuts to his wrists. And when the police officer asked this man for his name, he responded saying, quote, "You'll know me. I'm the man who's killed his wife and family." This man was, of course, Philip Austin. He'd made it all the way to the Lake District and he tried to kill himself by cutting his wrist. He'd clearly seen or heard on the news that the bodies of his family had been found and that there was a police manhunt for him, and I guess he'd just given up by this point and decided to try and end it. So 31-year-old Philip Austin was arrested there and then for the murders of his wife and 2 children, but before he was taken to the police station for questioning, they firstly transported him to a nearby hospital for treatment on his arm, although, to be honest, these cuts to his wrist were described as being pretty superficial injuries. They wouldn't have been enough to kill him at all, so he'd not actually made that much of an effort to take his own life. Following his treatment, he was taken to a police station in Northampton so that he could be interviewed by Northampton detectives, as they were obviously the ones handling this case. And he immediately confessed. He didn't try at all to deny it. He straight up admitted that, yep, he was the one who killed his wife Claire, their 2 kids, Jade and Kieran, and the family dogs. His account of that fateful day is as follows. So the morning of the 10th of July 2000 initially seemed to be like any other for the Austin family. Philip recalled how he had been to work the night before this. He actually worked night shifts as a forklift truck driver. So he worked his night shift, he then returned home in the morning and he took his 2 children, Kieran and Jade, to school. Now usually after he had dropped the kids off, because he'd been up all night, Philip would go straight back home and he would sleep. However, not this day. On this particular day, Philip had other plans. From his kids' school, he firstly went to a local McDonald's and he had a breakfast meal, which, as we know, the remnants of was later found in his abandoned car. From here, he then visited a shop and he purchased the newspaper for that day, as well as the Auto Trader magazine, and he sat in his car flicking through the magazine and circling cars that were of interest to him, cars that he could potentially later use to go on the run. And then it was following this when Philip Austin went to a local massage parlour, as he had an appointment there to have sex with a sex worker, which, as far as the police were aware, was not a regular occurrence for him. They couldn't find anything to indicate that this was something that Philip did often or in fact had ever done before, I don't believe. And yet, for some reason, on the morning of the murders, he decided to also cheat on his wife. Following his appointment, Philip Austin visited a DIY shop nearby where he purchased a mallet. Again, that same blood-stained mallet that was later found in his car. And from here, he finally headed back to his address. Now, Philip claimed that he only bought this mallet because he was doing some work on his patio in the garden of his home and he needed it for that. However, the police were not convinced of course. Apparently this mallet wasn't even the type of mallet or the type of tool that Philip would have needed for the kind of work that he said he was doing. But anyway, once Philip arrived home in the early afternoon of the 20th, his account was that an argument quickly broke out between him and his wife Claire in their bedroom upstairs, because Claire was questioning Philip on where on earth he had been all morning. As I mentioned, he'd worked a night shift previously, and usually after every single night shift he would come home and sleep, but he didn't on this day. So Claire asked him why, what had he been doing? So she was questioning him on his whereabouts. According to Philip, they also started arguing about this holiday that Claire wanted to book, and Philip said that this fight between them escalated and turned physical. He turned physical. Philip described in his interview how this, quote, red mist just descended on him. He became so angry that he went to take a swing at Claire. He went to punch her, only he realised after he punched her that he was still holding that mallet that he just brought from the DIY shop. So he'd hit Claire with the mallet. He hit her in the arm, and from here a violent struggle ensued between them. Claire immediately tried to run out of the bedroom. The police could see from things that had been knocked over in the house where there had been a struggle. They noticed Claire's slippers had come off, where it's believed she was trying to flee. Her earrings had been ripped out during the struggle and were found in 2 different spots in the house. Claire ran all the way downstairs and went to open the front door to escape her husband, and she did manage to open the front door. However, Philip immediately slammed it shut and the fight continued. They fought in the downstairs bathroom. Philip had his hands around Claire's neck and he began trying to strangle her, but once again Claire was able to get away and she ran into the kitchen. However, it was there where she either tripped and she fell onto the floor, or Philip managed to tackle her to the floor, and it was on that kitchen floor where he killed her. He put his hands around her throat again, trying to strangle her. He described also lifting up her head and banging it down on the ground repeatedly. And it was as a result of all of this when Claire became very weak and she actually started to fall into unconsciousness. And now that she couldn't really defend herself, she couldn't really fight back, Philip got off of Claire. I think he was literally sitting on top of her so that she couldn't move. But he got up, he went and grabbed the mallet from wherever he had dropped it in the house during the struggle. He returned to Claire on the floor in the kitchen and he began beating her with it. But the attack didn't stop there. It was far from over. He also grabbed a knife from the kitchen and began stabbing Claire in the chest with it. As we know, he stabbed her with so much force that the handle snapped off, so he just picked up another knife and proceeded to stab her with that. And in addition to that, he also grabbed one of Claire's bras from the laundry basket, and using that he continued to strangle her. And if you remember, this bra was still found tied around her neck when her body was discovered. Following all of these horrendous injuries Claire had sustained, of course she died on that kitchen floor. However, that was just the beginning of the horrors that Philip Austin would carry out that day. Now, Philip Austin tried to claim in his interview with the police that he didn't really know what he was doing during the attack on Claire, that this red mist just descended on him and he couldn't control his rage. And he basically tried to make out like there was no premeditation here. He didn't plan to kill his wife that day. However, of course, his actions from earlier that morning strongly indicated otherwise. The fact that he went and bought an Auto Trader magazine to try and find what would clearly be his getaway car, the fact that he went and purchased a mallet, even the fact that he went and booked an appointment with a sex worker. It's almost like in his head he was thinking, well, I'm gonna kill my wife later today anyway, so what does it matter if I cheat on her too? But also the fact that he essentially used 3 different methods to kill Claire. He didn't just beat her with the mallet, he also stabbed her and strangled her. And between each of these, there was a period of time where he had to stop and I guess think about what he was going to do next, what weapon he was going to use next on Claire. At any time between those, between beating Claire and then stabbing her and then strangling her, he could have stopped. He could have stopped and thought, what on earth am I doing? But he didn't. He carried on with his vicious attack. He made the decision to carry on with his attack and take the life of the woman that he was supposed to love and protect. After Claire was dead, Philip told the detectives that he used the mallet to beat the 2 family dogs to death, Dandy and Sooty, as they had been barking during the attack on Claire, and he was worried that they would alert the neighbours, and so yeah, he just killed them too. The only pet that he didn't kill, the only surviving member of this family, was their family cat Snoopy, because obviously Snoopy wasn't barking, wasn't causing a problem for Austin. Once the dogs were dead, he then went upstairs to change out of his blood-stained clothes. He changed his trousers as his beige cargo pants had blood spatter on them, and then he decided that he was going to try and make an effort to begin to cover his tracks, essentially, or at least buy himself some time. He left the house and he drove to Claire's place of work, where he told them that she wouldn't be in for a little while. She wouldn't be in work because she was having some issues with her back. He obviously did that to, again, try and buy himself some time so that her work wouldn't worry when she didn't show up over the next couple of days. After leaving Claire's work, he then went to purchase what would be his getaway car, one of the cars that he'd circled in the Auto Trader magazine. And what's even more chilling is that when the police went and spoke with the man that Philip had purchased this car from, the car salesman, he said that Philip literally seemed completely normal during the sale. He seemed calm and relaxed. There was nothing about him or his behaviour which raised any alarm bells, I suppose, which, considering that this is a man that has just beaten and brutally murdered his wife and 2 dogs, I mean, it's insane, isn't it, really, that he's able to just carry on as normal, as if nothing had happened. After buying the car, he drove his own vehicle to that area where he ditched it outside of that house in Northampton. He just abandoned it there. And then Philip realised that it was time to collect the kids from school. So he went and picked up Kieran and Jade, but he didn't go home with them straight away. Philip actually decided to just drive around with them in the car for a while. Well, I say for a while, but actually it was established that he'd driven around with them for about 7 hours. 7 whole hours he just drove aimlessly around. During these 7 hours, he went to a fish and chip shop to get the kids some food, some dinner, because obviously they would have been hungry after school, and he actually laced this food, essentially. He put this Nitol medication in their drinks. Nitol, if you are unaware, is a sedative, an over-the-counter sedative to help with temporary insomnia. And he said that the reason he did this, the reason that he drugged the kids' drinks and drove them around for hours on end, was because he wanted them to be as sleepy as possible before he took them back to the house, so that they would go straight to bed and wouldn't see their mother's dead body on the kitchen floor. Although a lot of people don't believe this, a lot of people believe that the real reason he drugged them was so that it would be easier for him to take their lives too, because they would be so tired that they wouldn't be able to fight back. Eventually, when the kids were very, very sleepy, he finally returned back home with them and he put them straight to bed. Philip said that he just sat downstairs on his own for a while whilst his wife's battered body and the dog's bodies still led in the kitchen. And then, after a short period of time, he said that his youngest child, Jade, woke up. She stood at the top of the stairs and she asked her dad if she could have a glass of water because she was thirsty. And Philip claimed in his interview that it was then, when Jade came downstairs and he went to fetch her a glass of water, that the reality of what he had done just suddenly came back to him. I think he essentially tried to claim that his mind had almost blocked it out up until this point, blocked out his wife's murder. He was able to dissociate from it. But when Jade came downstairs and asked for that drink, it was like a smack in the face with reality for him. And he said that it was in that moment when he decided that he was going to kill the children too. He claimed that he did think about just taking Jade and Kieran to their grandparents' house, to Carol and Harry's house, and leaving them there, but he didn't. And we can assume that the reason he didn't was because obviously he knew that he was going to try and go on the run, and Carol and Harry would have known that something was wrong if Philip had just randomly turned up with the kids, and they likely would have gone straight to Claire's house and found her body. And he didn't want that. He needed to try and get away first. And so he decided to just kill the children. He went upstairs into 7-year-old Jade's bedroom and began throttling her, attempting to strangle her to death. And only when he used a dressing gown cord was he successful. He wrapped it around his daughter's neck and strangled her with it until she was dead. And then he just left Jade's little lifeless body on her bedroom floor. After Jade was dead, he headed to 8-year-old Kieran's bedroom and did the same to him. He used a child's strap, which is often used as almost like a lead by parents with their kids, a lead to attach to their kids. And using this strap, he strangled Kieran to death too. He was strangled on his bed. I mean, it defies belief, doesn't it, that a man can do that to his own children. Murder in any form or under any circumstance is just something that I don't think any of us can ever truly grasp or fathom. But in this instance, where the perpetrator can brutally and cruelly take the lives of their own child, their own flesh and blood, there are just no words for it. And it rocked the local community when news of the murder spread. As you can imagine, everyone was just absolutely devastated and also shocked, because it didn't really seem as though anyone could have predicted this. No one could have seen this coming from Philip Austin. Like we discussed earlier, from an outsider's perspective, the Austin family appeared to be your typical, ordinary, happy family. Philip himself seemed like a normal, hardworking family man, but that's the thing with abusive partners like Philip Austin, isn't it? They are very, very clever like that. Clever to keep their abuse behind closed doors so as not to arouse suspicion. And it was easier for him to hide the abuse because it was mainly mental abuse towards Claire anyway. It wasn't like Claire would be seen with a load of injuries and bruises, because it was emotional. She was emotionally abused and controlled by her husband. It's believed that for Philip, this whole crime centered around control. That was his motive. He probably felt like his relationship with Claire was getting to the point where he was losing that power over her. Because as I mentioned earlier, she was starting to become that bit more independent. She had more free time now that the kids were at school. So she was able to get herself her own car. She was able to have a bit more of a social life and get a job so that she could earn her own money. And she didn't have to rely on Philip financially anymore. And he would have absolutely hated that. He wanted her to be dependent on him because he knew that that way she would just put up with his abusive behavior. I wonder if maybe he worried that soon Claire would probably leave him because she would have realized that actually she didn't need him and she didn't need to live under his thumb anymore. And he couldn't let that happen. He would apparently rather kill her and their children than let that day come. Of course, we know his movements after the killing spree. He went on the run. He travelled to different areas around the north of England until finally 10 days after the crime, on the 20th of July 2000, he was apprehended and questioned. Now, something that the detectives noticed, they couldn't help but notice, was how chillingly calm Philip Austin was in his interview with the police. He was talking them through the day that he committed the murders of his wife and 2 children, and it was honestly like he was talking about the weather or something. There was no care there. He showed no ounce of remorse. It was like he just didn't give a crap, to be honest with you. And so after he gave his version of events, the detectives tried to ask him questions along the lines of, you know, Philip, how are you feeling? How do you actually feel about what you've done? And Philip, calmly as ever, just replied, quote, well, I'm not proud of what I've done. And that was it. As far as showing any form of guilt, that was all the detectives got from Philip Austin. Following his arrest and his interview, Austin was charged with 3 counts of murder. Now, when it came to his court proceedings, Philip initially decided to plead not guilty to the charges, despite the fact that he'd already given a full confession. But he wasn't denying that he'd done this. He was still admitting that he was the one who took their lives. However, he pleaded not guilty to murder on the grounds of diminished responsibility. His defense team were going to try and claim that Austin was mentally unstable at the time of the killing, which caused him to just kind of dissociate, and he didn't actually realize what he was doing. He couldn't control what he was doing, and therefore therefore he couldn't be held responsible. That's the route that the defence were going to go down anyway, to try and get Philip Austin the lightest sentence possible. However, they encountered a very, very big issue with this argument because they couldn't find a psychiatrist to back this up. They had Austin undergo psychiatric evaluations from a few professionals, I think, and none of them believed for 1 minute that he was suffering from any kind of mental illness that would explain his actions. And so the defence were forced to kind of abandon this strategy, and Austin changed his plea. He changed it to guilty. He pleaded guilty to all 3 murders, and at his sentencing he was handed 3 life sentences to run concurrently for the killings of Claire, Kieran and Jade. Now 3 life sentences obviously sounds like a hefty punishment, right? Rightly so, makes it sound like Austin will probably die behind bars. However, his sentence was actually 3 life sentences with a minimum tariff of 18 years. So after just 18 years, he would be able to apply for parole and potentially be released, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, was absolutely devastating for the family of the victims. To them, that was not justice at all, because 18 years equates to just 6 years per life. 6 years, even less than that if you count the 2 dogs. So understandably, that did not seem fair at all. So I believe they did campaign for it to be increased, which it was, but only to a minimum of 20 years, an extra 2 years. But alas, that was the court's decision, and obviously 20 years has passed now. Austin's 20-year minimum term would have come to an end in 2021, and he did immediately try to apply for parole in 2021. However, he was rejected. He applied to be moved to a category D prison, an open prison, but his application was turned down. He tried again 2 years later in 2023, but was once again rejected. However, his case will come up for review again this year in 2025. So I guess all that we can hope for is that his application continues to be rejected, because the thought of this man being moved to an open prison and then eventually being let out is just terrifying. And again, just seems so incredibly unfair. Doesn't seem like justice at all, does it? Now, I did come across an online petition which was set up in 2021 when Philip first came up for parole. It was created by the family of the victims, and it's a petition for life to mean life in the British justice system, as they believe that people like Philip Austin do not deserve second chances, a chance to possibly reoffend and take the lives of even more people. So I will leave a link to that petition in the description box below. I'm sure that it would mean a lot to the loved ones of Claire, Jade and Kieran if you went and signed it. It literally just takes a couple of minutes to do, if that, and it could make a huge difference. But that brings us to the end of this case. That concludes the case of Claire, Kieran and Jade and the Austin family murders. An absolutely tragic case. I'm struggling to find the words to really sum up my thoughts on this case, to be honest. It's not often that I actually cover familiar-side cases like this, because I just think that they are amongst some of the most heartbreaking, especially when there are children involved. But yeah, that is it for this video. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on this case in the comments. I would love to hear what you guys think, and feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. Again, you can pop them in the comments, or you can go through my case request form, which is linked in the description box. A quick thank you once again to Heyday for very kindly sponsoring this video, and a reminder that you can click the link in the description or scan the QR code that is on the screen right now to claim an exclusive 16-item reward pack worth $15.99. You have until the 15th of February to claim, so be quick. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye.